Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Because if what follows is true, if even a fraction of it has weight, then time zones may matter more than you think. Some things wait beneath the threshold of consciousness. They are not remembered, but dreamed. Not taught, but intuited. Not constructed, but inherited like bone-deep impulses. The cults that still pray to Cthulhu, if such entities exist at all, do not wear robes in public or recruit from city streets. They operate in whispers, in fragments, in coded texts, in altered dreams. And yet, disturbingly, they persist, threading themselves through literature, media, and the quiet recesses of modern subcultures. We do not ask whether they are real in the conventional sense. That question is too small. The better question is, why do so many people keep acting as if they are? This documentary is not about believers. It is about belief, its mechanics, its mythic vessels, and its unsettling implications. We will examine how H.P. Lovecraft constructed the Cthulhu mythos from fragments of cosmic pessimism, and how later generations reshaped those fragments into mimetic faiths and speculative cults. Drawing from anthropology, literary history, and modern psychology, we will trace the lineages of invented horror that now bleed into our cultural margins, sometimes ironically, sometimes not. The modern myth of Cthulhu begins not in ancient scripture nor obscure ethnographic record, but in the fevered imagination of a man beset by cosmic dread and literary ambition. H.P. Lovecraft, writing in 1926, conjured the call of Cthulhu as a convergence point for his deep-seated philosophical pessimism, his fascination with antiquity, and his cultivated sense of alienation. But the story was never meant to be merely a tale. Rather, it functioned as a mythopoetic cipher, a meditation on humanity's precarious position in a universe devoid of meaning, warmth, or permanence. Lovecraft's fictional cults, those scattered, unknowable worshippers who keep the old one's name alive, are not ancillary. They are the pulse of the story, the persistent whisper that civilization is neither universal nor immune. We must recognize that in introducing Cthulhu's followers, Lovecraft was writing not about monsters, but about memory, specifically what it means to preserve memory older than humanity itself. Lovecraft lived through a time of profound cultural and scientific disorientation. Born in 1890 and dying in relative obscurity in 1937, he witnessed the end of Victorian certainty and the rise of post-war nihilism. The revelations of Darwinism, Freudian psychology, and Einsteinian relativity had already begun to unravel the tightly bound fabric of traditional Western thought. In this intellectual climate, Lovecraft imagined a cosmos in which humans were not central, but irrelevant, a blip on a dispassionate cosmic canvas. The notion of cults, who remembered beings like Cthulhu, thus served as a literary device to amplify this irrelevance. They are not simply groups of fanatics. They are carriers of a truth so vast, so ancient, and so antithetical to human understanding that it induces madness. Lovecraft's depiction of them, speaking in forgotten tongues, gathering in swamps and stone ruins, evokes the terror of continuity, that the old world did not disappear, but waits. We must pause here to examine the duality of Lovecraft's intention. He did not write cults as villains, nor as plot mechanisms. Rather, they are ritual proxies, stand-ins for all the hidden systems that modernity refuses to see. Consider the Louisiana Bayou sect described in The Call of Cthulhu, or the Eskimo shamans in the frozen north. Their existence is both improbable and deeply plausible, echoing colonialist anxieties about foreign belief systems surviving beneath the crust of Western rationalism. In this way, the cults function not as isolated inventions, but as symbolic heirs to a long tradition of outsider knowledge, knowledge that the dominant culture suppresses or denies. Here we must also note Lovecraft's personal biases. His xenophobia, though morally indefensible, serves as a window into how he mapped cultural difference onto cosmic difference. The cults became, for him, a metaphor for the unassimilable. A crucial historical subtext in Lovecraft's creation of cults is the rising popularity of real-life secret societies and esoteric orders during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Theosophical Society, founded 1875, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, 1887, and later the Ordo Templi Orientis, founded 1902, captivated public imagination with their claims of hidden truths, ancient rituals, and cosmic correspondences. Lovecraft, an avid reader of weird fiction and pseudoscience, was certainly aware of these groups, even if he remained skeptical of their validity. What he did, however, was more radical. He stripped the purpose from these societies and kept the structure. His cults do not seek enlightenment or moral elevation. They do not even believe in salvation. They pray to Cthulhu because he is there, because he was, because his dreams leak into theirs. It is not faith, but compulsion. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's vision. Belief is not an act of will, but of infection. The cults in his stories do not proselytize. They do not debate doctrine. They simply persist, like viruses in a host. This inversion of traditional religious structure is key to understanding their horror. They do not offer answers or meaning. Instead, they embody ontological corruption. They make one aware of something that should not be known, and once known, cannot be unknown. This is not unlike the Gnostic notion of forbidden gnosis, a knowledge that liberates the soul at the cost of earthly sanity. Yet in Lovecraft's telling, there is no salvation beyond the veil, only deeper strangeness, only the devouring unknowable. His cults are not pathfinders, but remnants, carriers of a pre-human memory. Let us return, briefly, to the textual architecture of the Call of Cthulhu. The story's nested narrative structure, letters within reports, within newspaper clippings, mirrors the obscured lineage of the cult itself. Information is never direct. It seeps. It decays. Each narrator finds only fragments, traces, and contradictory testimonies. This method mirrors how real-world scholars investigate lost religions through ruins, misaligned calendars, and unreliable translations. Lovecraft was not only constructing myth, he was mimicking the archaeology of myth. His cultists are defined not by what they do, but by how little we can know about them. We must consider, what does it mean for fiction to simulate the experience of uncovering forbidden belief, rather than simply presenting it? The answer lies in narrative structure as ritual, a slow unveiling that never resolves. And so we are left with a final irony. Lovecraft, a man deeply skeptical of religion, created one of the most enduring pseudo-religious frameworks in modern fiction. His cults, imagined in 1926, have become templates for real-world belief systems, artistic movements, and psychological archetypes. But this is not merely about influence. It is about the persistence of form. Secret cults to Cthulhu may not exist in the way spy agencies or census bureaus define existence, but they exist as memes, as metaphors, as unspoken fears, passed from story to story, dream to dream. We must ask, what does it say about us that we continue to reproduce these cults, that we keep dreaming of those who never stopped believing? The mythos of Cthulhu did not arise in a vacuum. While Lovecraft claimed originality in his conception of cosmic horror, his work is deeply indebted to older cultural and philosophical lineages, many of which grapple with themes of secret knowledge, forbidden worship, and the terrifying unknowability of the divine. To trace the cults that pray to Cthulhu is to uncover a buried stratum of intellectual and religious inheritance extending far beyond fiction. These cults echo not merely fabricated stories, but archetypes of dark belief, expressions of spiritual estrangement, and metaphysical dislocation that recur across time and civilization. From ancient mystery religions to post-Enlightenment philosophical despair, the resonances are striking. Consider this carefully. The form of the cult is older than the name of the god it serves. Among the most significant precursors are the ancient mystery cults of the Greco-Roman world, ritualistic traditions like the Eleusinian mysteries, Orphism, and the Dionysian rites. These sects operated on the margins of public religion, emphasizing secrecy, initiation, and the revelation of hidden cosmic truths. What little we know of their practices suggests ecstatic experiences, symbolic death, and rebirth, and a promise of access to realities beyond the waking world. Lovecraft's cults bear a chilling structural similarity. They operate in obscurity, speak in a sacred language, and offer no salvation, only confrontation with something vast and ancient. But unlike Eleusis or Dionysus, whose rites promised spiritual continuity, Cthulhu offers only collapse. The continuity is not for the soul, but for the memory of something older than humanity. This is not redemption. It is recollection of a truth that undoes the self. One cannot examine these roots without turning to Gnostic thought. Emerging in the first centuries of the Common Era, Gnosticism posited that the material world was the flawed creation of a demiurge, a lesser god who trapped the divine spark within a corrupted reality. Salvation in this framework required the acquisition of hidden knowledge, gnosis, that allowed the soul to transcend the world's illusion. Lovecraft inverts this structure. His fictional cults do not seek escape, but embrace the terror of forbidden knowledge. The Necronomicon is not a path to light, but a descent into mental and existential ruin. And the knowledge it offers does not liberate, it fragments. We must recognize here a profound philosophical inversion. The Gnostic soul sought its origin in the light. The Lovecraftian cultist seeks the origin in the abyss. If the Gnostic dreamt of returning to a pure, hidden source, the cultist of Cthulhu dreams only of being devoured by it. There is also a thematic resonance with Eastern traditions, particularly certain strains of Hinduism and Buddhism, which posit cyclical time, illusory reality, Maya, and the dissolution of self. The concept of R'lyeh, the sunken city where Cthulhu lies dreaming, evokes the idea of cosmic slumber between great cycles of awakening and destruction, a motif echoed in Hindu cosmology through the sleeping Vishnu or Shiva's dance of annihilation. But again, Lovecraft offers no moral or spiritual framing, only terror. In traditional Eastern systems, the destruction of self can lead to enlightenment. In the Cthulhu mythos, the destruction of self is total, irreversible, and meaningless. It is not a metaphor, it is a fate. The philosophical foundations of Lovecraft's cults are also indebted to 19th century pessimism. The writings of Arthur Schopenhauer, who whose bleak view of existence as driven by irrational will and endless suffering find dark reflection in Lovecraft's worlds. Likewise, Friedrich Nietzsche's proclamation of the death of God and his diagnosis of modernity's spiritual void paved the way for a literature of meaninglessness. Lovecraft took this further. Not only is God dead, but what lurks behind the veil is not God at all, but something vastly older and less comprehensible. If Nietzsche's abyss stares back, Lovecraft's devours. The cultist then becomes not a seeker of salvation, but a willing participant in annihilation, an avatar of a philosophy that accepts, even worships, entropy. Consider also the role of colonial imagination in shaping the imagery of forbidden cults. European explorers often described the religious practices of indigenous peoples as barbaric, pagan, or demonic, projecting their own fears of cultural disintegration onto the other. Lovecraft, writing in the shadow of empire, drew heavily, often problematically, from this discourse. The global distribution of his fictional cults, New Orleans, the Arctic, the Pacific Islands, mirrors the geographies of colonial encounter. These worshippers are not portrayed as evil so much as unfathomable, as if their beliefs preserve something prehuman. This framing taps into a recurring fear that there exist pockets of the world where time has not advanced, where the ancient continues, unseen and unchanged. The cults of Cthulhu, then, are metaphors not just for forgotten religions, but for the enduring failure of modernity to erase them. This reveals something significant. The cult is a cultural constant. Across traditions, time periods, and geographies, humans have formed clandestine groups devoted to hidden truths, truths that often challenge or destabilize dominant norms. The fact that Lovecraft's imaginary cults resonate so deeply is not evidence of his unique genius alone, but of his ability to tap into this underlying archetype. He understood, perhaps unconsciously, that the idea of a secret order keeping vigil over an ancient forbidden god was not new, but very old. His innovation was to strip it of comfort, to remove the possibility of moral alignment or esoteric uplift. What remains is a cult that prays not for protection, but for awakening, and what it seeks to awaken is not divine justice or cosmic love, but the thing that dreams in the deep. If belief in Cthulhu is an act of remembering something older than humanity, then language becomes its most unstable medium. The names, chants, and invocations associated with Cthulhu cults are not just decorative elements in Lovecraft's fiction. They are integral to how the mythos functions. Language in this context is not merely symbolic, but corruptive. It infects. It erodes clarity. It resists systematization. The so-called Cthulhu cults do not rely on coherent scriptures or theological doctrine, but on vocal artifacts, guttural phonemes, incomprehensible glyphs, and sigils that refuse translation. This is no accident. Lovecraft understood something fundamental, that true horror is not what we see, but what we cannot name. The moment we try, language breaks. The most famous incantation, Fenglui Magunaf, Cthulhu, Relia, Ugarnagul Ftang, appears in the Call of Cthulhu as a ritual phrase repeated by cultists across disparate geographies. It is presented not as a slogan or prayer, but as a sonic virus passed along through dreams, madness, and whisper networks. Lovecraft claimed that it translated loosely as, in his house at Relia, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming, though he repeatedly emphasized that human mouths were not built to pronounce it properly. The The word Cthulhu itself, he stated in private letters, is only an approximation, a compromise between phonetic possibility and alien precision. The name is meant to resist comprehension. This is not simply aesthetic, it is philosophical. If the divine is truly alien, then it cannot be spoken of in our terms. The unpronounceable is not just unfamiliar, it is ontologically other. We must recognize the symbolic implications of this linguistic fracture. In most religious or mythic systems, names carry power. To speak the name of a deity is to invoke its presence, to form a connection between human and divine. But in Lovecraft's mythos, speech does not bridge that gap. It exposes its futility. The cultist does not speak to be understood, but to be unmade. The chant is not communication, it is submission. Consider this carefully. When language becomes meaningless, ritual becomes raw affect, a form of participation in the unknowable. This is a reversal of magical thinking. In traditional spellcraft, words shape reality. In Lovecraft, words disintegrate it. This linguistic instability extends to Lovecraft's invented tomes and languages. The Necronomicon, the most infamous of his apocryphal grimoires, is often described as written in multiple scripts, some recognizable, others not. The book contains formulas and chants that drive readers to insanity, not because of what they describe, but because of how they function. They are linguistic traps, syntactic mazes that rearrange perception. This resembles the ancient idea of the barbarous names in mystical traditions, words of unknown origin used in rituals not for their semantic meaning, but for their vibrational power. We see echoes of this in the Enochian language of John Dee and Edward Kelly, the glossolalia of Pentecostal worship, or even the Kabbalistic practice of meditating on divine names. But Lovecraft's names do not elevate, they unravel. There is also a visual component to this linguistic horror. Lovecraft often references non-Euclidean sigils, symbols that defy geometry and cognitive coherence. These glyphs are typically carved into idols, scrawled in ancient texts, or tattooed on the flesh of cultists. Their purpose is never explicitly defined, but their effect is consistent: disorientation, obsession, and madness. This recalls the talismanic use of symbols in mystical traditions, such as the Seal of Solomon or the sigils of the Gotia, but once again, Lovecraft twists the convention. In his work, the symbol does not protect, it invites. It does not mark sacred space, it punctures reality. The cultist who bears these symbols is not blessed, but claimed. We must pause here to examine a deeper implication. Lovecraft's entire linguistic strategy suggests that the closer one gets to the truth of Cthulhu, the less human language can describe it. This is a radical inversion of religious revelation. In Abrahamic traditions, divine truth becomes increasingly clearer as one draws near. In Lovecraft's cosmology, clarity is a curse. Understanding breeds collapse. The cultist's chant, then, is not a tool for illuminating the god. It is a confession that the god cannot be known. In this sense, the cult becomes a community of those who have abandoned linguistic coherence in favor of sacred disintegration. What binds them is not meaning, but exposure to a common ruin. This reveals a circular horror. To name Cthulhu is to invite him, but to truly understand that name is to lose all capacity to use language meaningfully. The cultist inhabits this paradox. They speak what they do not understand. They write what they cannot read, and yet they believe, not in salvation, but in return, in awakening, in recurrence, In the final breach of silence, the language of the cult is not a tool. It is a symptom of exposure, of infection, of metaphysical proximity to something that language was never meant to frame. The power of Lovecraft's mythos lies not merely in its content, but in its construction. His stories resonate not because they provide answers, but because they simulate the discovery of a hidden world, one that feels older than the narrative itself. In this way, Lovecraft was not just a writer of horror, he was a myth maker in the classical sense. He employed the tools of scholarly authority, citations, invented texts, unreliable narrators, and fragmented records, to suggest that the myth of Cthulhu was not invented, but recovered. This illusion of recovery, this architecture of authenticity, is central to understanding why the idea of Cthulhu cults has endured beyond literature and seeped into cultural folklore. Consider carefully, Lovecraft did not merely create a myth. He created the conditions in which myths become believable. One of the most effective devices in Lovecraft's myth building is the use of invented scholarly texts, most famously the Necronomicon. This fictional grimoire, supposedly written by the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, is cited in multiple stories as a real source, quoted, referenced, and discussed as though it exists within a network of historical knowledge. Lovecraft reinforces this illusion by attributing it to known institutions: Miskatonic University, the British Museum, the Bibliothèque Nationale. He also surrounds the Necronomicon with other invented texts: unaussprechlichen Kulten, the Book of Iban, the Pnakotic manuscripts, creating a synthetic library of the forbidden. This intertextual scaffolding mimics the way real mythologies evolve, through layers, revisions, contradictions, and regional variations. It is not a single truth, but a constellation of partial revelations. The reader becomes, in effect, an anthropologist sifting through fragments. We must recognize the sophistication of this technique. In Lovecraft's fiction, the occultist is rarely encountered directly. More often, we learn of them through case files, journal entries, news clippings, and anthropological reports. This narrative distance adds to the realism. It mirrors the way scholars study lost religions through fragments of pottery, scattered inscriptions, and second-hand accounts. The horror, therefore, is not immediate, but mediated. It accrues through layers of interpretation. In The Call of Cthulhu, for example, the narrator pieces together the truth of the cult through disparate documents, never encountering the cosmic horror directly. The story becomes a ritual of assembly, mirroring the cult's own structure, fractured, veiled, and ever on the edge of revelation. This method is especially effective in cultivating narrative doubt, a crucial aspect of Lovecraftian horror. The narrators themselves often question their sanity, hedge their claims, or explicitly state their inability to verify sources. This hesitancy functions as an invitation to the reader to believe more deeply. After all, if the narrator is trying not to believe, then the evidence must be all the more compelling. This rhetorical sleight of hand mirrors the style of conspiracy theory and esoteric literature, where the presentation of forbidden knowledge is always accompanied by a sense of danger and suppression. It is not simply what is said, but the sense that someone doesn't want you to know it. In Lovecraft, the cults gain power not through presence, but through absence. They haunt the margins of the text. We must pause here to consider the philosophical implications of this narrative structure. By embedding his myth within a web of forged evidence, Lovecraft reveals the fragility of epistemology. What counts as real? What can be trusted? If a fictional book can be referenced often enough, across enough stories, with enough scholarly apparatus, does it not begin to function as real in the reader's mind? This is not mere literary trickery. It is a profound commentary on the construction of knowledge itself. Lovecraft anticipates what postmodern theorists would later call hyperreality, the condition in which simulacra, copies with no original, come to define truth. The Necronomicon does not need to exist to be believed in. It only needs to be structured as if it does. This blending of fiction and academic framing has had tangible cultural consequences. Since the mid-20th century, numerous fake editions of the Necronomicon have been published, sometimes presented as genuine occult texts. Certain neo-pagan and esoteric groups have incorporated elements of the mythos into their rituals. In online communities, forums dedicated to Lovecraftian deities discuss dream phenomena, symbolic synchronicities, and pseudo-anthropological theories about the mythos. These are not mere fan groups. Some operate on the threshold of belief and performance, blurring the line between homage and invocation. The cults, in a sense, have become real through repetition and structure. It is not belief in the literal truth of Cthulhu that matters. It is the reenactment of mythic behavior, secrecy, initiation, symbolic speech, and narrative layering. This reveals something unsettling about the nature of authenticity itself. In traditional religious systems, authenticity is anchored in historical revelation, doctrinal authority, or institutional continuity. In Lovecraft's mythos, authenticity arises through textual mimicry, the performance of scholarly depth, the layering of invented sources, the evocation of archival density. The reader is not asked to suspend disbelief, but to slowly assemble belief, piece by piece, as though stumbling onto something long buried. The cults that worship Cthulhu may not exist as organized bodies, but they persist as narrative behaviors replicated in fiction, ritual, and digital subculture. They are not religions, but simulations of religion, ritualized doubt masquerading as belief. And so we end this section where we began, with the idea that myth is less about what is true and more about what is structured like truth. Lovecraft understood that if a lie is told in the language of archaeology, of anthropology, of fragmented reportage, it begins to gain the gravity of fact. The cults, scattered and contradictory though they may be, are believable precisely because they are unverifiable. They feel ancient because they feel lost. And we, the readers, the scholars, the dreamers, are always chasing what was never meant to be found. To understand the cults that revere Cthulhu, one must first confront the philosophical terrain on which such reverence is built. These are not belief systems grounded in morality, salvation, or even coherence. Rather, they are oriented around concepts that destabilize the very foundations of human thought: cosmic insignificance, entropy as ontology, and the porous boundary between dream and reality. Unlike traditional religious frameworks, which offer purpose or redemption, the Cthulhu mythos offers neither comfort nor resolution. It is not simply about fear of the unknown, but about the irrelevance of the known. The worshippers of Cthulhu do not follow him for wisdom or hope. They surrender to him because he embodies a truth too vast and too ancient to be denied. At the heart of Lovecraft's philosophical horror lies the idea of insignificance, not emotional diminishment, but ontological negation. In the now famous opening of The Call of Cthulhu, the narrator writes, "The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents." This sentence is not a warning, but a thesis. To correlate everything would mean realizing that human history, biology, culture, and thought are ephemeral distortions, illusions of order in a universe governed by scale and indifference. The cultist, in this context, is one who has glimpsed the wider totality and recognizes the futility of resistance. What appears to be madness is in fact a kind of metaphysical surrender, not a rejection of life, but an acknowledgement that life is incidental. We must recognize how radical this is. Most worldviews, whether spiritual or secular, assume some degree of anthropocentrism, humans as central actors, interpreters, or recipients of cosmic meaning. Lovecraft's vision inverts this assumption. In The Whisperer in Darkness, he describes alien entities who regard humanity the way we might regard an insect colony, observable, perhaps even interesting, but ultimately disposable. Cthulhu, as a symbol, is not a malevolent god, but a non-interventionist enormity whose awakening would not be judgment, but disruption. The cultist does not plead with Cthulhu. They prepare. They anticipate. Their rituals are not moral appeals, but alignments, ways of harmonizing with forces beyond comprehension. This leads us directly to the second core theme, entropy. In most cosmologies, order is either sustained or restored, but Lovecraft's mythos posits that disorder, not as chaos or randomness, but as fundamental collapse, is the resting state of the universe. Cthulhu's sleep is not a pause, but a pressure. His dreaming imposes a kind of stasis on reality, and his awakening promises the unraveling of all constructed form. Consider the architecture of R'lyeh, described in The Call of Cthulhu, as composed of non-Euclidean geometry, where angles behave in impossible ways. This is not stylistic surrealism. It is ontological foreshadowing. The physical laws we depend on are temporary scaffolds. The cultist, again, is not deluded, but attuned. Their madness stems from witnessing a universe that tends toward unmaking, not toward becoming. It is not a coincidence that entropy plays a liturgical role in many depictions of the cult. Rituals are often performed in decaying locations, swamps, ruins, undersea cities, abandoned churches. The environment becomes a theological statement, degradation as sacred space. Unlike religions that build temples to preserve and control, Lovecraftian cults embrace erosion. They gather in the margins, in thresholds between stability and dissolution. The entropy is not just physical, but psychological. Identities fray, languages distort, and dreams bleed into reality. It is here that we must turn to the final concept, one that binds the others together, dream reality. Dreams are not merely symbolic in Lovecraft's mythos. They are ontological arenas, spaces where the mind interfaces with truths the waking world cannot support. In The Call of Cthulhu, dreams are how Cthulhu communicates, not telepathically, but archetypally, through collective unconscious fragments that induce visions, compulsions, and linguistic infection. The cultist's dreams are not fantasies. They are transmissions. Their content is often spatial, non-Euclidean cities, cyclopean ruins, impossible geometries. These dreams bypass rational cognition and affect the body, causing seizures, glossolalia, or amnesiac states. This suggests a deeper claim. The waking reality is not primary, but contingent. The cultist, through repeated exposure to dream events, begins to experience waking life as the false state. The boundaries collapse. We must pause here to consider, what if the dream is more accurate than perception? What if consciousness itself is a membrane, thinning under the pressure of buried memory? This inversion, where sleep becomes revelation and waking becomes illusion, has deep mythological roots. From the Upanishadic assertion that waking and dreaming are two states of the same self, to Plato's cave metaphor, the idea that reality is a mask has persisted for millennia. But in Lovecraft's world, the mask does not conceal beauty or truth. It conceals magnitude, and the cultist, by tearing it, ceases to be human in any meaningful sense. This reveals a chilling synthesis. The cultist is not a fool or a fanatic. They are an initiate into a metaphysical system that reverses human assumptions. Life is incidental, order is decaying, and waking is false. Their worship is not aspirational, but adaptive. They do not seek power, they seek alignment with the inevitable. This is not devotion, it is synchronization with the disintegration of meaning itself. And from this position, they begin to act not as individuals, but as conduits for what sleeps and dreams beneath. To understand the cults that still pray to Cthulhu, one must first examine the entities they claim to venerate. These beings, vast, non-human, pre-temporal, occupy a category wholly distinct from gods in conventional theology. They are not omniscient, nor benevolent, nor morally engaged. They are existences, not personalities. The so-called Great Old Ones, along with dreamland entities and avatars of entropy, represent not forces of nature, but conditions of reality. Their worshippers do not seek communion, but proximity, a closeness to something older than thought, vaster than time, and wholly alien to the human frame. Consider carefully. The cultist does not worship to change the world. They worship because the world is already changing, and these beings are what it is becoming. The central figure is, of course, Cthulhu, described in the Call of Cthulhu as a thing which lay abnormally elongated and flabby, with a pulpy, tentacled head, claws, and a scaly, rubbery body. But physical description is misleading. Cthulhu is not a monster. It is a vector of contact. Its form disturbs, not because it is grotesque, but because it violates coherence. Its geometry is wrong, its movement unnatural, and its very presence disrupts space and mind alike. Importantly, Cthulhu does not act. It sleeps. It dreams. Its influence spreads not through intention, but through dreaming emissions, telepathic bleed that alters the minds of those nearby or sufficiently attuned. Cultists interpret these transmissions as sacred utterances, as liturgical mandates to prepare for the return. This waiting is not hopeful. It is anticipatory. Cthulhu is not a savior. It is a reversion. We must recognize the larger cosmology in which Cthulhu resides. He is one of many such entities, the so-called Great Old Ones, beings who predate the known universe, who exist either outside time or in dormant states within it. Other named Old Ones include Yog-Sothoth, Shub-Niggurath, and Nyarlathotep. Each of these figures embodies a different principle of cosmic instability. Yog-Sothoth, for example, is described as being coterminous with all time and space, a being who is the totality of existence and thus cannot be approached or understood. Cults that venerate Yog-Sothoth often pursue esoteric knowledge, ritual mathematics, or dimensional rupture, forms of invocation not through prayer but through symbolic alignment. This suggests that worship in the mythos is less about communication and more about configuration, tuning the self or the space to to resonate with a higher order being. Nyarlathotep occupies a unique position. Unlike the other entities who are largely dormant or spatially distant, Nyarlathotep is active, mobile, and often human-like in form. Described in multiple stories as a messenger or avatar, Nyarlathotep walks among humans, spreading madness through performances, machines, or whispered truths. He is not merely a figure of chaos. He is a sociological virus, exploiting the very structures, language, science, spectacle that modern society depends on. Cults of Nyarlathotep often resemble political or technological movements, their rituals disguised as art, science, or ideology. The horror here is that of complicity. The cultist does not know they serve him until it is too late. In this sense, Nyarlathotep embodies the idea that cultic alignment can be accidental, that one might enact the will of an old one simply by participating in modernity. Another dimension of these entities lies in the dreamlands, an alternate realm explored in Lovecraft's less overtly horrific works, such as the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath. Here, the boundary between reality and imagination dissolves entirely. The dreamlands are not a hallucination, but a parallel metaphysical zone, accessible through dream and ritual. Within this space dwell beings who straddle the line between nightmare and divinity. The faceless night gaunts, the ghouls, the zoogs, and the crawling chaos of Nyarlathotep in one of his many guises. Cultists in the waking world sometimes report revelations in dream, which may not be dreams at all, but interactions with this adjacent layer of existence. This raises a disturbing question. If reality and dream can be traversed, which is primary? The dreamlands suggest that what we dismiss as hallucination may in fact be transmission. We must pause to consider a recurring implication. These entities do not merely exist outside of humanity. They may exist beneath it, within it. The theme of atavism, the idea that humans carry ancient, non-human memories in their blood or minds, appears frequently. In the shadow over Innsmouth, the deep ones interbreed with coastal villages, producing hybrid offspring who eventually return to the sea. The worshippers in that story form the esoteric order of Dagon, a structured cult with rituals, rites, and a pantheon that includes Dagon, Hydra, and Cthulhu. Their belief is not symbolic, it is biological. They worship because they are becoming the thing they revere. This marks a crucial distinction. The cultist is not a separate observer of the entity, but a transitional form, a vessel for its eventual emergence. This reveals something profoundly unsettling, that the line between human and old one is not fixed. It is porous, and the cultist is not merely a believer, but a mutation, a philosophical and physiological transformation in progress. The entities do not care, in the human sense, whether they are worshipped, but the act of worship, through dreams, through ritual, through biological alignment, brings the cultist closer to their essence. This is not faith, it is osmosis. The boundary between deity and devotee is not one of scale, but of stage. The cultist is what the entity once was, or what it will become again. Worship is not reverence, it is metamorphosis. The human mind, fragile and adaptive, is often celebrated for its capacity to absorb new paradigms. But what happens when the paradigm it encounters is too vast, too alien, too fundamentally misaligned with biological or conceptual survival? In Lovecraft's mythos, the answer is clear. Madness is not failure, but consequence. It is the natural result of exposure to truths the mind was never designed to hold. Cults devoted to Cthulhu, and other entities embody this principle. Their members are not merely delusional, they are transformed. Interaction with the old ones alters perception, language, and cognition, until the line between sanity and revelation is no longer discernible. We must recognize that in Lovecraft's vision, madness is not a retreat from reality. It is an accidental collision with its deeper layers. This theme appears most explicitly in the Call of Cthulhu, where multiple individuals, from artists to sailors to academics, suffer psychic collapse following dream visions or indirect encounters with the submerged city of R'lyeh. The sculptor Henry Anthony Wilcox experiences disjointed, unintelligible dreams, which coincide with global psychic disturbances. His mind becomes a receptor, not through intent, but proximity to Cthulhu's dream wake. Others suffer worse fates. Inspector Legrasse's documentation of a backwoods cult in Louisiana reveals participants who babble nonsense, chant in unearthly tongues, and speak of great Cthulhu with an ecstatic reverence that blurs fear and longing. The implication is consistent. Madness is not random, but induced. It is what happens when the symbolic order cracks and the unspeakable rushes in. We must pause here and ask, what is the purpose of madness in this framework? In classical literature and theology, madness is often a punishment or warning, a descent into chaos for those who defy order. In Lovecraft, however, madness is epistemic overload. It is not the absence of sense, but its overabundance. The cultist, by virtue of contact, through dreams, artifacts, or biological memory, knows too much. This mirrors Gnostic and mystical traditions, where divine knowledge can overwhelm the soul. But whereas mysticism seeks unity, the Lovecraftian initiate encounters multiplicity without coherence. Their mind does not expand, it fractures. The cults, then, become support structures, not for recovery, but for containment. Ritual offers a scaffolding within which the madness can be sustained, if not healed. Consider the strange hybrid of theology and pathology in The Shadow Out of Time, where the protagonist becomes the unwitting host for a non-human intelligence. His memory is erased and replaced by the consciousness of an ancient, time-traveling race. When he returns to his body, he experiences fragmented memories, gaps in perception, and obsessive visions of alien architecture. He begins to write in strange scripts and speak in languages he never learned. Though not explicitly labeled occultist, his condition reflects a core dynamic, possession through knowledge. This is not demonic in the traditional sense. It is cognitive displacement. The human brain becomes an archival tool for something older and wider. The cultist in this model is not so much a believer as a host. This suggests a broader philosophical claim. The human mind is not neutral. It is structured to interpret reality in ways that preserve cohesion. The cultist's madness reveals the limits of that structure. The Necronomicon, often described as a vector of madness, does not harm through supernatural force, but through information density. Its contents defy logic, invert chronology, and reveal a cosmology in which humanity is incidental. Reading it is akin to downloading a code that the hardware of the brain cannot run. Madness, then, is a formatting error, a collapse caused by exposure to non-human data. The cult offers a temporary reprieve by providing symbolic anchors, chants, idols, sigils that localize the vastness into ritual action. And yet, the function of madness within these cults is not wholly pathological. It becomes paradoxically a currency of authenticity. The more unmoored a member is from consensus reality, the closer they are perceived to be to the truth. This inversion of normative cognition is essential to cultic identity. In The Haunter of the Dark, the protagonist's obsessive investigation of a cursed church leads to increasing delirium. He perceives shadows no one else can see, hears voices in the static, and speaks in tongues. But to him, these are not signs of illness, they are confirmation. The cultist's madness is not weakness, it is initiation. It marks the point where language fails and knowing begins. The horror lies not in losing one's mind, but in realizing that the mind was never suited to the universe in the first place. We must now consider the implications. If the cultist is a person who has crossed the threshold of comprehension, then their rituals, writings, and beliefs are not superstitions, but coping mechanisms. They preserve identity in the face of ontological collapse. They are attempts to map the void, even as the void rewrites the map. Madness becomes not a flaw, but a faculty, a mode of perception attuned to entropy, scale, and asymmetry. The cult, then, is less an institution and more a mimetic quarantine. It contains a truth that spreads not through argument, but through exposure. And once exposed, the individual is never truly the same. There is a persistent idea in myth, mysticism, and philosophy that some knowledge is dangerous, not because of its content, but because of its effect. In the Cthulhu mythos, this idea becomes foundational. Forbidden knowledge is not simply hidden knowledge. It is a category of understanding that deconstructs the structures used to hold reality together. In Lovecraft's world, to know is to unmake. Cultists who worship Cthulhu and the other old ones are not merely believers. They are witnesses to truths that annihilate the frameworks of sanity, language, and metaphysics. Their faith is not a leap into the unknown, but a consequence of stepping too far into what should remain unknowable. We must recognize that in the mythos, knowledge does not empower, it corrupts. The classic vector of such corruption is the Necronomicon, the apocryphal tome attributed to Abdul al-Hazred. Repeated across multiple stories, this fictional grimoire is treated with scholarly seriousness, quoted in footnotes, referenced in libraries, suppressed by institutions. But the Necronomicon is not a spell book in the fantasy tradition. It is more akin to a cognitive minefield, a compendium of cosmological revelations that destabilize the reader's sense of continuity. Lovecraft describes it as containing knowledge that hath driven men mad, and its function is thematic rather than procedural. It doesn't teach rituals to control the universe. It reveals the universe as uncontrollable. The cultist who reads it does not gain power. They lose the illusion of coherence. In doing so, they align themselves with that which lies beyond structure. This collapse of knowledge is more than metaphor. In Lovecraft's stories, attempts to catalog, translate, or analyze mythos phenomena inevitably lead to disintegration. In the Dunwich Horror, the Miskatonic professors use incantations from the Necronomicon to banish a monstrous entity, but even their academic detachment is tinged with dread. Dr. Armitage, who plays the rational investigator, hints that what they've uncovered is just a fragment of something vaster. Similarly, in At the Mountains of Madness, a scientific expedition to Antarctica uncovers the ruins of an alien civilization, only to realize that they are witnessing the remnants of a story too large for the human mind to hold. The knowledge they uncover is ancient, non-human, and persistent. The deeper they go, the more their frameworks of geology, biology, and history fail them. The implication is clear. Human disciplines are not equipped for cosmic truth. This is where the concept of epistemic collapse enters. In philosophy, epistemology is the study of how we know what we know. In Lovecraft's horror, this process itself becomes unstable. The methods of reason, observation, and analysis begin to erode when applied to entities like Cthulhu or Yog-Sothoth. We must consider what happens when your tools of knowing, your language, your logic, your senses, are no longer valid. The cultist is the figure who has already crossed that threshold. They no longer seek to make sense of the world. They accept that sense itself is provisional. Their madness, then, is not irrationality. It is post-rationality. They continue to act, to speak, to perform ritual. But those actions are no longer anchored in meaning. They are, instead, echoes of exposure. Lovecraft often portrays institutions of knowledge as sites of contamination. Universities, libraries, museums, these are not bastions of reason, but fault lines, where the human desire to preserve order intersects with the mythos' pressure to dissolve it. The cultist does not always begin in the swamp or the jungle. Many begin in the archive. This blurring of scholarship and sacrilege appears most clearly in The Whisperer in Darkness, where correspondence between academics becomes a channel for extraterrestrial intrusion. The horror is not that the university is attacked. It is that the university invites the collapse by opening the wrong book. In this context, the cult is not the opposite of science. It is what science becomes when it is exposed to truths outside its paradigm. We must pause here to examine the ethical inversion. In traditional literature, forbidden knowledge is dangerous because it is tied to pride. Like Prometheus or Faust, the seeker suffers for overreaching. In Lovecraft, the problem is not overreaching. It is that the universe is fundamentally indifferent to our reaching. The cultist does not fall because they transgress moral boundaries, but because they understand too much. Their rituals, their chants, their glyphs are not attempts to rewrite reality, but to adapt to its true form. This is not hubris. It is resignation. They know that knowledge cannot be unlearned, and so they surrender to the very collapse it brings. This reveals something troubling about the nature of belief. Cults in the Cthulhu mythos do not form around values, ethics, or salvation. They form around cognitive trauma. Their cohesion is not social, but epistemological. They gather to preserve fragments of comprehension in the aftermath of revelation. In this way, the cult is not a church, but a fallout shelter, a space where the survivors of intellectual detonation gather to share what remains. Their scriptures are incoherent, their doctrines self-negating, their rituals recursive. But this incoherence is not dysfunction. It is design. The cult exists precisely because no other system can contain what they now know. The mythos of Cthulhu and the cults that revere him did not arrive fully formed. They emerged gradually through a constellation of early texts, interconnected motifs, and the recursive layering of stories within stories. Lovecraft was not merely inventing a world. He was constructing a narrative ecology, one where each tale deepened the reader's sense of a hidden, coherent, and terrifying reality just beneath the surface. The earliest appearances of the cults, particularly in The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, Dagon, 1919, and The Nameless City, 1921, offer crucial insight into how the seeds of cosmic horror were sown. In these works, the function of the cult is not simply to venerate a monster, but to act as a living conduit to a pre-human continuity, a survival of belief older than civilization itself. In the Call of Cthulhu, the cult is explicitly named and described for the first time. The story's structure, a nested narrative composed of notes, reports, and fragmented accounts, mirrors the fragmented nature of the cult's presence across the world. Inspector Legrasse's raid on a backwoods Louisiana ceremony reveals a congregation chanting Fung Lui Mgluanaf Cthulhu Rulia Bgahnagal Vtagen, surrounding an idol of the sleeping god. Legrasse later learns from scholars that similar cults exist among Arctic tribes and Pacific Islanders, suggesting a global diffusion of forbidden worship. This multiplicity is vital. Cthulhu's cult is not centralized, but fractal, appearing in disconnected geographies, yet unified by a common dream language and symbol. It suggests something more disturbing than coordination. It suggests inheritance. We must recognize that this tale, often cited as the cornerstone of the mythos, does not merely introduce Cthulhu. It constructs a model for how Lovecraftian horror operates. The cultists here are not villains in the traditional sense. They are carriers of an ancient memory, simultaneously pitiable and threatening. Their beliefs are not irrational. They are pre-rational, grounded in a vision of the world that precedes language and law. Lovecraft writes that they believe it would be a mistake to call Cthulhu evil, for the entity was beyond morality. This moral ambiguity is echoed in the cult's behavior. While their rituals are grotesque, they do not act out of malice, but out of cosmic inevitability. They believe not because they choose to, but because something older than belief compels them. Before the Call of Cthulhu, the story Dagon, 1919, laid the groundwork for much of what would follow. In it, a shell-shocked World War I veteran recounts encountering a vast underwater monolith carved with non-human symbols and bearing witness to a massive sea creature rising from the depths. Although the cult is not named, the narrator's psychological collapse and obsession with oceanic worship prefigure the themes Lovecraft would later codify. He writes, "I dream of a day when they may rise above the billows to drag down in their reeking talons the remnants of puny, war-exhausted mankind." This foreshadows Cthulhu's eventual awakening and the role of worshippers who anticipate it. The story's structure, confessional, subjective, and unresolved, also introduces a key technique, making the narrator's descent into madness part of the evidence for the myth's reality. In this way, Dagon acts as an incipient cult text, centered not around communal ritual, but around individual revelation and collapse. The Nameless City, 1921, introduces another vital element, the archaeology of belief. In this tale, an explorer uncovers an ancient desert ruin built by a non-human race, described in serpentine and inhuman terms. Though not explicitly tied to the Cthulhu mythos, the story is saturated with thematic precursors, a subterranean civilization, a sacred text written in an undecipherable language, and a narrator who loses his grip on sanity. The city is not just a setting, it is a residual presence, a place that still remembers itself. It was of this place that Abdul al-Hazred, the mad poet, dreamed, Lovecraft writes, embedding the cultic reverence in physical space. The architecture becomes liturgical. The ruin itself is the scripture. The unnamed city suggests a place where belief has fossilized, waiting to be reawakened by the wrong scholar. These early stories also hint at the intertextual latticework Lovecraft was building, a mythos where names, symbols, and references recur across narratives. The Necronomicon, for example, first appears in The Hound, 1922, but its influence bleeds into nearly every later tale. Similarly, characters like Abdul al-Hazred and entities like Dagon reappear in various guises, giving the impression of a shared universe. This structure encourages reader participation. Each new story adds context to previous ones, building a sense of cumulative dread. The cults, by extension, become networked presences, less a single organization than a series of manifestations shaped by locale, lineage, and proximity to the unspeakable. We must consider the narrative function of this design. The cults are never fully described. Their doctrines are fragmentary, their rituals glimpsed, but never catalogued. This narrative restraint serves a critical purpose. It invites speculation while maintaining the aura of the forbidden. Lovecraft's avoidance of exhaustive exposition mimics the behavior of real-world esoteric traditions, which guard their inner teachings through obfuscation and layered meaning. In doing so, he invites the reader to become a kind of initiate, a seeker of hidden truth, drawn into the myth by partial exposure. The cult becomes not just a fictional device, but a reading experience. Every story, a ritual, every detail, a glyph to decode. This reveals the brilliance of Lovecraft's myth-making. The cults he introduces in these early tales are not static, symbolic stand-ins. They are evolving narrative engines, mechanisms for deepening the mythos while maintaining its core themes of madness, obscure truth, and cosmic indifference. The earliest appearances do not define the cults so much as initiate them, leaving later writers and readers to fill in the gaps. To understand how Lovecraft shaped the enduring image of the Cthulhu cult, we must examine the Call of Cthulhu, not just as a horror story, but as a blueprint for mythological construction. First published in Weird Tales in 1928, the story functions as a masterclass in epistemic layering, fragmented narrative, and ritual suggestion. It is in this tale that Lovecraft first renders Cthulhu not merely as a monster, but as a metaphysical pressure point, a dormant intelligence whose dreams infect human consciousness, whose name echoes through disparate cultures, and whose worshippers operate on the margins of civilization, awaiting a return that is both inevitable and incomprehensible. The cult, as presented in this story, is not a unified religion. It is a distributed residue of something older than humanity. The implications, though fictional, remain haunting. The story is framed as a documentary collage, told through the voice of Francis Wayland Thurston, who inherits his deceased uncle's academic papers. These include a strange bas-relief, the dream records of a delirious artist, newspaper clippings about a deranged sailor, and a transcript of a police raid on a cult ceremony. This format serves two purposes. First, it mimics the structure of academic research, creating the illusion of authenticity. Second, it presents the cult not as a centralized force, but as a synchronicity, a phenomenon that emerges in scattered places, speaking the same words and dreaming the same visions. Lovecraft writes, "A horror from beyond time and space, which had lain dormant for millennia, was stirring." This sense of an awakening across global consciousness is key. The cult is not spreading, it is re-emerging. One of the most iconic depictions of the cult occurs in the description of Inspector Legras's 1908 raid on a ritual deep in the swamps outside New Orleans. The scene, though brief, is rich with suggestive detail. Legras and his men find a congregation of squat, primitive men, surrounding a carved idol of Cthulhu and chanting in an unknown tongue. The idol is described as having a pulpy, tentacled head and a scaly, rubbery-looking body. When questioned, the cultists claim the being is great, Cthulhu, and that he lies sleeping beneath the sea in the sunken city of R'lyeh. This scene is significant not only because it introduces the now iconic figure, but because it connects linguistic, material, and ritual elements into a coherent mythic structure. The chant, Funglui Mglwanaf, Cthulhu R'lyeh Ukahnagulftagan, becomes both a mantra and a metaphysical truth. Cthulhu dreams and therefore is. We must recognize how Lovecraft uses this scene to invert traditional religious aesthetics. The cult is not gathered in a temple of light, but in a primeval swamp, illuminated by torches, engaged in a rite that evokes both awe and dread. They are not priests in robes, but near bestial celebrants, yet their knowledge, passed down orally, surpasses the scholarship of modern academia. This reversal is crucial. The cultist is not less informed than the scholar. He is more aligned with reality. While Miskatonics professors speculate and translate, the cultist already knows. Their knowledge is not intellectual, but embodied. Ritual becomes a mnemonic device for preserving truths too vast to articulate. In this sense, the cult operates as a parallel epistemology, a living archive of the cosmic real. The second major encounter occurs with Gustav Johansen, the Norwegian sailor whose ship stumbles upon R'lyeh itself. Johansen's description of the city is one of geometric dislocation and perceptual horror, an angle which was acute, but behaved as if it were obtuse. The architecture, like the god it houses, defies human categories. His crew is driven mad or killed by Cthulhu's brief emergence, an event that is described not as a physical attack, but a spatial breach. Johansen alone escapes, and his testimony, written in a private manuscript discovered after his death, forms the final piece of Thurston's puzzle. But Johansen is no cultist. He is an accidental witness, and his silence afterward suggests that contact with the mythos is a one-way path. Knowledge leads not to power or evangelism, but to retreat and decay. This multi-threaded narrative achieves several important functions. It refracts the cult through multiple lenses: anthropological, artistic, nautical, and academic, each offering a partial glimpse into the phenomenon. The structure implies that the cult is not fictional within the fiction. Rather, it is a persistent anomaly that resists containment by any single discipline. It does not appear through organized religion or military conquest, but through coincidence, dream, and ruin. This approach mirrors the reader's own process of discovery. We are not told the truth directly, but invited to piece it together from fragments. The cult exists in this narrative structure as a shadow network, its coherence emerging only through repetition. This reveals something crucial about Lovecraft's method. He does not explain the cult, he implies it. We never learn its origin, its hierarchy, or its internal theology. We are given fragments: an idol, a chant, a swamp rite, a sunken city. But these fragments cohere, not because they are complete, but because they resonate. They mimic the process of real myth formation, where oral tradition, sacred art, and recurring symbols create meaning across generations. Lovecraft thus positions the Cthulhu cult not as a literary invention, but as a mythopoetic inevitability. It is what happens when minds are exposed to the edges of reality. The cult is less a religion than a response mechanism, a pattern of behavior triggered by contact with the incomprehensible. If the Call of Cthulhu introduces the idea of distributed, fractured cults aligned with cosmic forces, The Shadow over Innsmouth, written in 1931, published in 1936, deepens the concept by embedding it within a decaying human society. In this story, the cult is not simply a group of worshippers operating in secret. It is an entire town, a corrupted community whose traditions, beliefs, and bloodlines have been shaped by contact with the deep ones, amphibious beings linked to the pantheon of the great old ones, where Cole emphasized the horror of knowledge through dreams and distant symbols. Innsmouth offers a vision of worship through inheritance, a fusion of the biological, the economic, and the esoteric. Here, the cult is not only preserved, it reproduces. The narrative follows an unnamed protagonist who visits the dilapidated town of Innsmouth and gradually uncovers the dark secret of its inhabitants. The local religion, centered around the esoteric order of Dagon, worships a triad of aquatic deities, Father Dagon, Mother Hydra, and Great Cthulhu. The order is not a fringe sect. It has replaced Christianity as the town's dominant spiritual force. Meetings are held in the formerly Christian church, now stripped of crosses and transformed into a site of occult gathering. Rituals include animal sacrifice, invocations to the sea, and prayers for gold and fertility. The religious structure is both theological and transactional. In exchange for worship, the deep ones grant wealth via deep-sea treasures and interbreeding rites. This transactional faith reflects a deeper horror. The townspeople are not corrupted by ideology, but by expediency. Lovecraft's text suggests that the cult did not begin with madness, but with desperation. Captain Obed Marsh, a sea captain who founded the order after visiting the South Seas, brings back knowledge of the deep ones and their rites. He convinces the townspeople to abandon Christianity and adopt the worship of aquatic gods in exchange for gold and plentiful fish. This origin story subverts traditional narratives of cult formation. It is not spiritual epiphany, but economic collapse that paves the way. The town's decline, isolated, impoverished, desperate, creates the conditions for what might be called strategic heresy. This reveals a chilling reality. Belief systems aligned with the old ones are often embraced not because they are seductive, but because they are pragmatic in a world devoid of meaning or mercy. The narrative function of the cult in Innsmouth is multifaceted. On the surface, it appears to be a classic horror trope, a hidden, degenerate society preserving a forbidden religion. But Lovecraft twists this by implicating biology. The cult is not just a group of worshippers, it is a breeding program. Townspeople intermarry with the deep ones, producing hybrid offspring who appear human until a certain age, when they begin to physically transform and return to the sea. The protagonist, after fleeing the town and reporting it to federal authorities, eventually discovers that he is one of these hybrids, an heir to the very bloodline he sought to expose. He writes, "I shall swim out to that brooding reef in the sea and dive down through black abysses, and in that lair of the deep ones I shall be at home." The story ends not with escape, but with metamorphosis into belief. This biological horror extends the function of the cult beyond ritual into the domain of destiny. The esoteric order of Dagon is not something one joins. It is something one is born into or becomes. Worship here is not performative. It is embodied. The transformation of the Innsmouth residents is physical, psychological, and spiritual. occurring over time and culminating in complete assimilation into the Deep One's society beneath the sea. This erodes the notion of belief as choice. The cultist, in this context, is not persuaded or recruited. They are claimed by lineage, by blood, by the slow unfolding of a transformation already underway. This suggests that contact with mythos forces affects not just minds, but bodies, and that cultic identity may be latent, waiting to express itself. We must pause here to reflect on how Innsmouth complicates Lovecraft's broader mythos. While the Call of Cthulhu emphasizes fragmentation and incompleteness, Innsmouth offers cohesion. The esoteric order is organized, sustained across generations, and capable of resisting external scrutiny. Their success is precisely what draws federal attention, leading to a supposed government raid that arrests or eliminates many of the town's inhabitants. Yet even this attempt at eradication is tinged with ambiguity. The final scenes suggest that the Deep Ones endure, that the cult persists in the sea, and that the protagonist's transformation ensures the myth continues internally, regardless of external suppression. The cult is not a static institution. It is a process, social, genetic, mythic. This narrative strategy reveals a disturbing implication that one can belong to a cult without knowing it. The protagonist's discovery of his heritage mirrors the reader's own gradual realization that horror lies not outside the self, but within it. The true terror of Innsmouth is not the fish-like monsters or secret rites. It is the idea that belief is inherited, that one might already be part of the worship simply by virtue of being born in the wrong place or carrying the wrong blood. The esoteric order of Dagon is not a secret. It is a reminder that the past is not dead, that the sea remembers, and that worship can take the form of becoming. The cults that whisper the name of Cthulhu did not fade with Lovecraft's death in 1937. In fact, they became more defined, more structured, and more widely disseminated after his passing, not by supernatural design, but through literary collaboration, adaptation, and reinterpretation. If Lovecraft's original cults were fragmentary and elusive, then his successors would gradually codify them. Figures such as August Derleth, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert Bloch, and later Ramsey Campbell, Brian Lumley, and Caitlin R. Kiernan would each contribute to the expanding mythos, transforming Cthulhu's followers from shadowy dreamers into the framework of a mythological canon. This was not a betrayal of Lovecraft's vision, but a natural evolution, a myth that, like the gods it describes, multiplies through narrative infection. August Derleth stands as the most pivotal and most controversial architect of post-Lovecraftian mythos. As the co-founder of Arkham House, Derleth preserved and published Lovecraft's stories, ensuring they would outlive the pulp era, but he also imposed a dualistic theology onto Lovecraft's fundamentally indifferent cosmos. Where Lovecraft saw cosmic horror as a reflection of existential nihilism, Derleth reframed the mythos into a battle between good, elder gods, and evil, great old ones. In his reinterpretation, the cults became agents of malevolent forces working against a cosmic balance. He wrote of elemental alignments, associating beings like Cthulhu with water, Nyarlathotep with air, etc., and emphasized moral conflict, a notion alien to Lovecraft's worldview. In this framework, cults now had motive and agency, aligning themselves with destructive forces in defiance of universal order. We must recognize that Derleth's system, while inconsistent with Lovecraft's original intent, served a key function. It made the mythos narratively accessible. Readers could now grasp the mythological roles, chart genealogies, and categorize deities. The cults were no longer abstract expressions of entropy or dream contagion. They became players in a cosmic drama, akin to dark sects in high fantasy or religious zealots in apocalyptic fiction. This shift had consequences. It allowed for the proliferation of mythos-based games, stories, and adaptations, but it also flattened the philosophical depth of Lovecraft's creation. Cthulhu was no longer just the symbol of unknowable indifference. He risked becoming a villain in a pantheon, opposed by forces of light. Despite this shift, other writers retained and deepened Lovecraft's ambiguity. Ramsey Campbell, for instance, introduced the cult of Ihort and expanded the mythos into England's Severn Valley, treating cultic belief as a localized infection, something regional, insidious, and self-replicating. His work, particularly the darkest part of the woods, preserves Lovecraft's sense of scale and obliqueness. Similarly, Caitlin R. Kiernan's stories often blur the lines between science, madness, and belief. Her characters are not clear-eyed believers or moral rebels, but uncertain intermediaries caught in processes of transformation they cannot name. These writers emphasize the epistemological instability that Lovecraft revered, crafting cults that function as event horizons rather than coherent ideologies. Another notable contributor is Brian Lumley, whose Titus Crow series transforms the mythos into a more adventure-driven narrative where humans can resist, fight, and occasionally overcome the old ones. His cultists, while present, are often rendered as pawns, servants of larger forces they barely comprehend. In Lumley's work, the cults are contextualized as part of a broader war between dimensions. While entertaining, this framing once again militarizes the mythos, converting the cult from a philosophical expression of collapse into a strategic faction. It's a narrative decision that enables action but sacrifices subtlety. Perhaps the most influential modern expansion comes not from literature alone, but from games. Specifically, Chaosium's Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, first published in 1981. Drawing heavily on Derleth's framework, the game provides cult templates, rituals, hierarchies, and modular belief systems. Here, cults become playable structures, organizations with goals, members, doctrines, and secrets. Scenarios include infiltrating Deep One enclaves, disrupting Nyarlathotep's human followers, or recovering artifacts before cults can misuse them. The game turns cosmic horror into procedural horror, making the mythos interactive. But this interactivity demands systemization. Cults must be statted, mapped, and explained. Ironically, this formalization brings the cults closer to what real-world secret societies are imagined to be: hierarchical, goal-oriented, and ritualistic. We must pause here and ask, does codification weaken the horror? Lovecraft's original cults thrived in ambiguity. They were glimpsed, not described; heard, not catalogued. Their horror lay in absence. When later writers give them names, ranks, and motives, they arguably limit their terror. But this evolution also reveals something profound. The mythos is a living text, shaped by readers as much as by authors. The cult, once a symbol of epistemic collapse, becomes a mirror, reflecting the cultural and narrative needs of each generation. In the Cold War era, mythos cults became metaphors for ideological infiltration. In the age of surveillance, they are rendered as sleeper cells, In today's hyper-connected world, they mutate into online belief communities where irony, roleplay, and real conviction blur into a new form of mythic praxis. This reveals the paradox of longevity. To persist, a myth must adapt, but in adapting, it risks losing the very ambiguity that made it haunting. Lovecraft's cults were terrifying because they resisted comprehension. Later expansions make them usable, playable, narratable, but at the cost of transforming them into entities of function rather than existential reflection. Still, each iteration carries a shadow of the original. Each new writer, game master, or reader becomes in their own way a kind of cultist, preserving and reshaping a myth they cannot entirely claim or understand. There is a peculiar moment in the life of any myth when it slips its textual boundaries and begins to manifest in the world, not as literal truth, but as enacted narrative. The cults that pray to Cthulhu, once confined to pulp fiction and literary experimentation, have crossed that threshold. Over the past century, they have appeared not only in books, but in news reports, online forums, staged rituals, and whispered confessions. Whether through deliberate hoaxes, sincere belief, or ironic performance, people have begun to act as if these cults exist. And in doing so, they may have given them a new kind of reality. Consider carefully. When fiction is believed deeply enough, when it is enacted and repeated, it begins to function like memory. It becomes culture. The most well-known example of a Cthulhu-related hoax is the publication of the so-called Simon Necronomicon in 1977. Purporting to be a real grimoire translated from ancient Sumerian sources, this paperback artifact mixed Mesopotamian mythology, ceremonial magic, and Lovecraftian references into a dense occult manual. Its author, Simon, was a pseudonym, and while the book was initially dismissed by scholars and Lovecraftians alike as a cynical pastiche, it gained a substantial underground following. Occult stores carried it. Ritual groups performed its ceremonies. It was cited in online discussions and personal accounts of paranormal experiences. The book is not evidence of an actual cult, but of a desire for one, a hunger for structure, danger, and the thrilling blur between fiction and forbidden truth. In the decades that followed, digital spaces began to incubate a new kind of mythic behavior. From early Usenet threads in the 1990s to modern subreddits and Discord servers, users have shared experiences of Cthulhu-related dreams, reported sightings of strange symbols carved in trees or painted in tunnels, and speculated about government knowledge of sunken ruins. In many cases, these discussions begin in jest, Lovecraft as a shared cultural joke, but gradually adopt the trappings of sincerity. Photos of suspicious altars are posted without context. Invented chants circulate as reconstructions, ARGs, alternate reality games. Using mythos, themes blur fiction and reality so effectively that some participants reportedly drop out due to psychological distress. These digital cults are not organized religions, but viral mythic experiments. The participants are half initiates, half authors. We must pause to ask, why do people pretend to believe in something they know is fictional? One answer lies in the performance of belief. The idea that acting out a myth can be more meaningful than intellectual assent. The boundary between real and imagined becomes porous when the consequences of belief are felt. Chanting in a basement under ultraviolet light, surrounded by sigils, becomes a ritual not because it contacts an old one, but because it produces a shift in consciousness. The act of transgression, the aesthetic immersion, the refusal of consensus reality. All of these create a sacred frame, even if the object of worship is fictional. Cthulhu becomes a god not because he is real, but because the conditions of acting as if he is replicate those of ancient devotion. Some cases, however, step beyond performance. Over the years, scattered reports have surfaced of groups claiming to follow Cthulhuan teachings seriously. In 2007, for example, a group calling itself the Cthulhu Cult registered as a religious organization in the US, complete with ritual documents and membership structures. Their stated goal was both satirical and devotional, mocking traditional religions while also exploring the abyssal mystery. Other groups, often tied to chaos magic or postmodern occultism, have invoked Lovecraftian entities in ritual practice, not to worship them, but to engage their archetypal force. Figures like Peter J. Carroll and Kenneth Grant have referenced Lovecraft in magical systems, suggesting that mythos beings can function as modern equivalents of ancient demons, masks for unconscious forces, or access points to the liminal. Even more unsettling are the persistent urban legends and sightings that blur into conspiracy. Tales circulate of underwater ruins seen on sonar off the coast of Micronesia, of untranslatable inscriptions recovered from deep-sea expeditions, of entire fishing villages supposedly vanishing from remote coastlines. Most of these stories are unverifiable, citing anonymous sources, vague coordinates, or classified documents, yet they endure. Their persistence speaks not to their truth, but to a cultural hunger for rupture. In a hyper-rational world, the idea that something enormous and hidden still sleeps below the surface offers both horror and relief. It is not proof we seek. It is discontinuity, the belief that the world might be more than what it seems. The cult, in this light, becomes a symbol of that hidden layer. This reveals something fundamental. The cult is no longer just a literary device. It has become a symbolic pattern, one that recurs wherever people long for mystery, transgression, or the sublime. The rituals may be fake, the books forged, the sightings anecdotal, but the function is real. The Cthulhu cult offers a way to frame alienation, to aestheticize dread, to ritualize the inexpressible. In a world saturated with information, it provides a space of secrecy. In a culture of irony, it offers a form of dangerous sincerity. And in a reality increasingly flattened by consensus, it suggests, quietly, darkly, that we have not seen everything yet. If Cthulhu's cult once thrived in the shadows, whispered in stories, hinted in symbols, traced in dreams, it now thrives also in the full light of cultural production. Over the past 50 years, the aesthetic and conceptual framework of the Cthulhu mythos has migrated from literature into film, video games, and music, reshaping how audiences encounter the idea of cosmic horror. In these adaptations, the cult does not disappear. It mutates, stylized, and systematized, sometimes diluted, sometimes sharpened. Whether portrayed directly as robed worshippers or evoked through ritual symbolism, the cult in popular media functions less as an organization and more as an emotional atmosphere, a narrative space where dread, madness, and awe converge, and its persistence speaks to something deeper, an ongoing cultural fascination with losing control, crossing thresholds, and meeting what waits beyond. In cinema, explicit depictions of Cthulhu cults are rare, but the thematic DNA of Lovecraftian horror runs deep. Films such as The Void, 2016, The Endless, 2017, and The Ritual, 2017, present isolated communities whose belief systems orbit unseen or inhuman entities. These groups perform rites, follow non-human logic, and worship not out of ignorance, but out of adaptation to a changed metaphysical reality. The Endless, in particular, depicts a rural cult trapped in a time loop controlled by a nameless entity. Their worship is not voluntary. It is survivalist, a synchronization with a being that punishes those who deviate. These films share a common pattern. The cult is not defeated. It is endured, suggesting that belief in such forces is not an error, but a recalibration of sanity in the face of the incomprehensible. Other films embrace visual and ritualistic cues. In the Mist, 2007, based on a Stephen King novella heavily influenced by Lovecraft, a religious cult emerges within a supermarket, led by a woman who claims the creatures outside are divine punishment. Though not a Cthulhu cult per se, it reflects the sociological function of such belief. In the face of the unknown, myth provides order. Guillermo del Toro's work often flirts with similar themes. In Hellboy, 2004, a cult explicitly invokes Lovecraftian beings, referring to the Ogdru Jahad, entities of chaos and tentacled oblivion. Their summoning is portrayed with ceremonial gravity, books, blood, planetary alignments, suggesting that the ritual structure of belief is as enduring as the beings it serves. The screen becomes a liturgy, the plot a performance of the cult's inevitability. In video games, the mythos finds one of its most natural homes, not simply as lore, but as experiential ritual. The Call of Cthulhu, tabletop role-playing game, first published in 1981 and later adapted into digital formats, 2018's Call of Cthulhu and 2021's The Sinking City, immerses players in investigations of arcane texts, strange cults, and creeping madness. Players rarely fight monsters directly. Instead, they manage their sanity, uncover forbidden knowledge, and attempt to survive long enough to piece together partial truths. The cults in these games are often the primary antagonists, not due to malice, but because they act in service of entities that destabilize reality. What makes these depictions so effective is their procedural uncertainty. Players must choose whether to read the curse book, perform the ritual, or resist the temptation. The game becomes a mirror of the cultist's dilemma. Beyond direct adaptations, video games such as Bloodborne 2015 and Darkest Dungeon 2016 borrow deeply from the mythos. In Bloodborne, the line between knowledge and madness is central. Worshippers of cosmic beings, known as the Great Ones, seek insight, a stat that allows players to see otherwise invisible entities. As insight grows, so does psychological instability, mirroring Lovecraft's principle of epistemic peril. The game's world is populated with chanting fanatics, twisted priests, and remnants of rituals gone wrong, each echoing a cultic structure fractured by contact with the divine. Darkest Dungeon introduces a similar idea. Cultists appear as enemies driven mad by knowledge, reduced to avatars of self-destruction in service of subterranean horrors. In both cases, gameplay becomes initiation, ritual through repetition, revelation through suffering. Music, too, has absorbed the mythos, not merely in lyrics, but in tone and atmosphere. The metal genre, particularly doom, black, and death metal, has long incorporated Lovecraftian themes. Bands such as Nile, Portal, Yog-Sothoth, and the Great Old Ones invoke mythos names directly, constructing sonic spaces of distortion, dissonance, and grandeur. The music itself often replicates the narrative of the cult, indecipherable lyrics, oppressive layering, and immersive soundscapes designed to evoke cosmic dread. ambient artists like Lusmord and Atrium Carcery take a subtler approach, creating dark, ambient albums that feel like rituals, low frequencies, echoing drones, field recordings of arcane chants. These compositions function as ritual texts without words. Listening becomes participation. We must ask, what does it mean for horror to be consumed as entertainment? Does adaptation defang the myth? Or does it, paradoxically, extend its reach? When audiences watch films or play games that feature cults, they are engaging in simulated initiation. They witness the signs, absorb the symbols, navigate the rites. Even if the frame is fictional, the structure of experience is preserved. This is not unique to the Cthulhu mythos. Religious stories, too, are reenacted in plays, festivals, and rituals. What makes the cultic aesthetic in popular culture distinct is its refusal of comfort. These stories rarely end in triumph. They end in silence, collapse, or revelation. And through repetition, the cult becomes not less frightening, but more familiar, not normalized, but recognized. This reveals a core paradox. Adaptation spreads the myth while compromising its ambiguity. But ambiguity is not the only source of power. The cults that pray to Cthulhu are not sustained by secrecy alone. They persist because they embody a question that cannot be answered. What if this is already happening? The stories we tell on screen, in sound, and in play allow us to inhabit that question, even briefly. And like ritual participants across history, we emerge altered, not because we now believe, but because we have performed belief. In the murk between parody and devotion, irony and belief, a curious phenomenon has emerged. People have begun to use the Cthulhu mythos not simply as story or symbol, but as a lens through which to interpret culture, power, and thought itself. The cult of Cthulhu, once a literary invention, has been appropriated by subcultures, political movements, and academic disciplines as both metaphor and method. This is no longer about fictional worship of a tentacled god. It is about what that god represents: alienation, decentralization, epistemic entropy, and the profound instability of meaning. In these spaces, the mythos functions not as superstition, but as critique. The cultist is not just a character. They are a model for how to inhabit a broken, postmodern world. One of the most visible and paradoxical subcultural appropriations is the so-called Church of the Subgenius, founded in the 1970s as a satirical religion. Though it does not center on Cthulhu, its pantheon of absurd alien gods and disdain for mainstream reality echoes the tone of Lovecraft's mythos. The church's slogans, slack off, fight the conspiracy, praise Bob, mirror the affect of mythos cults, ironic reverence, suspicion of truth, and chaos as gospel. Other groups, such as the First United Church of Cthulhu, have taken this one step further, claiming real religious status while openly acknowledging their mythic origins. These are not hoaxes or delusions. They are ritualized satire, a way to embody belief in a world that no longer trusts belief itself. The cult becomes a performance of existential awareness, a protest against sincerity in an age of collapse. Online culture has amplified this phenomenon. Forums, Discord communities, and meme ecosystems routinely deploy Lovecraftian symbols as shorthand for cosmic helplessness, absurd bureaucracy, or existential despair. The phrase, "I for one welcome our tentacled overlord," has become a kind of cultural reflex, half resignation, half ritual. Here the cultist is not wearing robes or chanting in Latin. They are posting gifs, generating ironic prayers, and treating despair as comedy. Yet we must ask, does irony protect us, or does it mask participation? When repeated enough, even mock rituals gain structure. Even absurd prayers begin to resonate. The internet has allowed the mythos to reformat itself as a distributed digital liturgy, where no one believes completely, but everyone acts as if something old and absurd is watching. Academia, too, has not remained immune. Scholars in literature, philosophy, and cultural studies have turned to Lovecraft and his cults as ways of exploring the limits of knowledge, the aesthetics of horror, and the politics of unknowability. In literary theory, the mythos is often read through the lens of post-structuralism. Cthulhu as the signifier of ultimate deferral, the cultist as the postmodern subject who recognizes the collapse of grand narratives. Philosopher Eugene Thacker, in the Dust of This Planet, 2011, explicitly engages with Lovecraft to develop his theory of the world without us, in which horror arises from confronting the world as indifferent and inhuman. For Thacker, the cultist represents the one who has seen the void and ceased to interpret it, one who exists in knowledge beyond comprehension. The cult becomes a stance, not just a story. We must recognize how this academic interest is not about validating Lovecraft's cosmology, but about using it as a tool for thinking. In sociology and religious studies, scholars have examined mythos cults as examples of hyper-real religion, faith systems that arise from fictional sources but are lived as real. The term, coined by sociologist Adam Possamai, is used to describe Jediism, Matrix-inspired Gnosticism, and notably, Cthulhu worship. These belief systems blur the lines between text and practice, fiction and faith. The cult becomes not a lie, but a deliberate simulation, a method of crafting meaning in a reality where traditional structures have failed. In this frame, the mythos is not escapism. It is confrontation with the absurd. Artists, too, have appropriated the cultic aesthetic, not as horror, but as critique. Visual artist Paul Laffoley's architectural drawings often include mythos references, treating Cthulhu not as monster, but as a model of non-human intelligence. Performance art collectives have staged Lovecraftian rituals in abandoned spaces, using them to explore themes of memory, trauma, and the body. One such piece, The Deep Rises, 2018, involved participants blindfolded and submerged in sensory deprivation tanks while being read selections from The Shadow over Innsmouth. The goal was not to scare, but to induce symbolic surrender, to allow the body to feel what the mythos proposes, that selfhood is porous and that the mind is not sovereign. This reveals a striking inversion. The cult is no longer a symbol of irrationality. It becomes a model for post-rationality, for how to exist when systems collapse, when truth fragments, when coherence fails. To adopt the cultic stance in art or theory is to say, I know this is fiction, but fiction is the only thing still structured enough to hold the truth. In this way, the mythos becomes a kind of negative theology, a discourse about what cannot be said, what must not be known, and what happens when you know it anyway. Even as we move away from the stories, the cults, the hoaxes, and the rituals, something lingers. The figure of Cthulhu recedes, the chanting ceases, the fictional veil is acknowledged, and yet the psychological weight of the myth does not disappear. Rather, it continues to echo in private thoughts, cultural behaviors, and philosophical anxieties. The question is no longer whether the cults are real, but why the idea of such cults continues to haunt the human mind. The myth of Cthulhu and the worship that coils around it, like kelp on a drowned altar, persists not because it is believed literally, but because it articulates something we already fear to be true, that the universe is not waiting for us. That meaning is a temporary structure. That knowledge, when taken too far, leads not to truth, but to collapse. One explanation lies in the myth's resonance with a fundamental human unease, our awareness of how little we matter in cosmic terms. In traditional religions, this insignificance is made bearable by divine attention, a God who sees, loves, redeems. In Lovecraft's vision, there is no such comfort. The gods, or rather the entities, do not care. They sleep, dream, devour, distort. The cultist is not chosen for virtue, but for exposure. Their faith is not rewarded, but eroded. And yet, paradoxically, people are drawn to this idea. It is not nihilism that attracts, but honesty. Cthulhu represents a vision of the universe that many suspect to be more accurate than the moral frameworks inherited from earlier eras. In this light, the cult becomes a model for a post-theistic ritualism, belief without comfort, faith without hope. We must recognize how deeply this theme resonates in times of cultural instability. In moments of ecological crisis, technological acceleration, or political breakdown, traditional narratives fail to provide orientation. The cults of Cthulhu mirror this breakdown. They are fragmented, decentralized, dissonant, held together not by doctrine, but by affect, dread, awe, fascination. This makes them peculiarly suited to our era. They model belief under conditions of epistemic failure. When truth is elusive, institutions untrustworthy, and meaning contingent, the idea of joining a group that worships entropy begins to feel less absurd, not as a literal option, but as a psychological metaphor. The cultist is the one who has stopped pretending that the universe makes sense and started behaving accordingly. But there is more at work here than cosmic despair. There is also the temptation of submission, the idea that one might relinquish control, not out of weakness, but as an act of realism. Cthulhu, after all, requires nothing. He does not demand morality, purity, or virtue. He only waits. His cultists do not try to fix the world. They acknowledge its trajectory. This is a kind of liberation, the freedom to stop striving for a coherent narrative, to stop stitching meaning into every gap. In this light, the Cthulhu cult becomes a kind of anti-theology, a refusal of the premise that life should make sense. And for some, that refusal is oddly soothing. We must pause here to reflect on a deeper, more troubling implication. What if the mythos persists, not because we fear it, but because we need it, not for truth, but for structure? In an age of ideological collapse, when institutions erode and language fragments, even fictional systems can offer orientation. The cult of Cthulhu is coherent in its incoherence. It provides a cosmology, a ritual language, a metaphysical scale. It does not lie about the horror. It makes the horror livable. The symbols, tentacles, ruins, chants, stars become containers for dread too large to express otherwise. They do not solve the problem. They ritualize it. And in doing so, they help the believer, the reader, the player, the viewer, endure. This brings us full circle. The cults that still pray to Cthulhu, whether in fiction or in metaphor, are not simply about gods. They are about how we organize ourselves in the face of the inhuman. They are rehearsals for collapse, experiments in mythic behavior under postmodern conditions. They persist because they dramatize what we cannot unknow, that knowledge is unstable, that language is limited, that the mind is porous, and that the universe does not promise resolution. In place of salvation, they offer repetition. In place of truth, a chant. In place of meaning, atmosphere. And so, we end not with certainty, but with unease. Not because the myth is true in any conventional sense, but because it describes something real, the shape of fear in the age of information. The code does not ask you to believe. It only asks you to remember what belief once felt like, when it was dangerous, forbidden, and full of dark wonder. Whether you laugh, recoil, or whisper the chant under your breath, you have already participated. You have already looked too long at the thing beneath. You know its name, even if your throat can't shape it. And now that you know, you cannot unknow.